Hi, family. Welcome back to Landline, your direct link to all things comedy, politics, and culture. I'm your host, Janaya Future Khan, champ yapper, and frequent nuisance in the comedy and activist worlds. Let's get dialed in. I got to tell you, we're in for a real... I guess the theme is resilience, because I'm going to be talking about Alice Munro's work. I'll get into that in a minute, but really what it means when... What do we do when we find out that somebody's kind of a terrible person? What do we do with their art? And then what does a future for Palestine look like now? Okay, so I am a couple of things at once. I am a nerd, I am a former English major, and I'm Canadian, which means nerd times nerd times nerd. And if you are any of those things, or if you're a literature buff, you know Alice Munro, and you know Alice Munro's work. So she is like this feminist author. She recently passed away at like 92. And like her work has become so prolific that she was a Nobel laureate, right? So that's like one of the highest honors you can have as an author, as a writer. And I got to tell you, I studied her work, right? That's what you do when you're a nerd times nerd times nerd. And I did get my English major. I got my English degree in Canada. So I definitely got very familiar with Alice Munro's work. It dealt with the tensions of gender roles and how we're all confined to like very small boxes, but specifically around women. You would be completely accurate to call her a feminist author, right? What do you do as a woman when you have these personal aspirations and then you're also meant to like conform to these domestic responsibilities? So at the time that she was writing, it was pretty groundbreaking, and she really pushed back on the societal expectations in women's lives. So specifically, if I'm using, you know, the themes that she went into beyond that, there was like a refusal to be bound by like the narrow definitions of womanhood. And she even went further and pushed around, you know, female sexuality and the nuances of that. And that was just not done at that time. And that is kind of service level around what made her work remarkable. Like, themes don't make good stories or good writers. Beautiful writers do that. So I got to tell you, I was pretty stunned. So I learned yesterday that Alice Munro's daughter, Andrea Skinner, had written an article, an essay in the Toronto Star. And in that essay, she details what happened when her mother learned that her partner, so her mother's partner, this guy named Gerald Fremlin, he sexually abused her when she was 9 years old. So Alice Munro's husband sexually abused Skinner when she was 9 years old, and would continue to do so until she was a teenager. And obviously this is one of the most horrific things imaginable. And when Skinner told her mother when she was in her 20s, I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this. She left him for a short period of time and then went back to him because she, and I quote, just loved him too much. And I really am trying to wrap my head around this. And this has so much to do with like disappointing. What happens when your parents don't protect you? What happens when your mother doesn't protect you and what that feels like? But it goes even further than that. Her specific response was, and I'm reading this, this is a direct quote from the essay. So this is Andrea Skinner's writing. She reacted exactly as I feared she would. In this case, she's talking about talking to her mother. She reacted exactly as I had feared she would, as if she had learned of an infidelity, Skinner wrote. She said that she had been told too late, that's a quote, she'd been told too late, she loved him too much, and that our misogynistic culture was to blame if I ever expected her to deny her own needs, sacrifice for her children, and make up for the failings of men. She was adamant that whatever had happened was between me and my stepfather. It had nothing to do with her. I gotta tell y'all, there's like so many levels that this is like horrific and disgusting, but I want us to pay specific attention to the way that feminist language is used to justify really shitty behavior. I'm bringing this up because A, it deserves to be brought up. What do we do when our literary icons or when our artistic icons are shitty people? And what do we do with their art? But also the ways in which we are now using therapy speak, feminist speak, social justice speak to justify really shitty behavior. And I feel like the people who are using that language the most are kind of like the shittiest people these days. Like, think about like when Jonah Hill was talking about, you know, how it was like triggering for him when his ex-partner wore a bikini. But this is so much worse. Let me break it down. So she goes, she loved him too much. That's whatever. Our misogynistic culture was to blame if I expected her to deny her own needs. Isn't it interesting that in her work, she was talking about the complexities of womanhood and how you have to deal with domestic responsibilities and personal aspirations. And she's using that to justify throwing her daughter to the fucking wolves. I'm just like, and there's a generation, I mean, I don't know a single person at this stage in my life, like from my generation, a little bit below, definitely above, who didn't have parents that just gaslit the shit out of them. Like, the reason why everybody's in therapy now is because they're trying to just stop the horrific generational trauma that went, well, my needs weren't met and I was abused, so I'm now going to abuse my children, and that's okay because I had a shitty life, and so I'm now doing that to others. And so when you realize that the themes of her work, think about R. Kelly and how many themes of his work had detailed his abuse and how he treated these girls. So here she is using feminist language that we applauded her for in her work, and now she's using it to say, well, what happened to you is between you and him, and I'm not responsible for that. And I'm going to tell you something, and this is purely speculative, but it's hard for me to believe that she didn't know at the time. How disconnected you would have to be from your child and from your life to not know that something was amiss is very hard. It's a very hard sell. So I'm just like, and then there's this other piece, right? That there was an expectation that she was supposed to sacrifice for her children and make up for the failings of men. So again, she's being held accountable for what her husband did. And it's like, no, you're being asked to care. Like, you're just being asked to give a damn about what happened to your child and maybe take action from that. But the fact that that's her orientation tells you a lot about that person. It made me think about Alice Walker. I love Alice Walker's work. I will read her writing forever, but it changed. My perception of that work changed. I mean, these are not equivalent scenarios, but it changed. My understanding of her work changed when I started to read her daughter's experience of growing up with Alice Walker and having a parent that was emotionally manipulative and emotionally abusive and cruel at times. She just was not. And there is something to be said, I think, for people who need that kind of space and need that kind of selfishness to be exceptional writers, but then just don't have children. Did it ever occur to you to just not procreate? I mean, isn't so much of your writing, Mrs. Munro, about being an individual, right? An individual who can't live without a dude, and an individual who's like willing to just like not give a fuck about what happens to your daughter. I'm just having a really hard time like wrapping my brain around this as somebody who was like really spoon-fed Munro's work because there's like 5 Canadian writers that people know about. And so, you know, it's just like she was adamant that whatever happened was between me and my stepfather. It had nothing to do with her. Can you imagine that your husband is a pedophile? Your husband is a pedophile, and you're saying that has nothing to do with me and abused your child. I just, I have been reeling around this, but also the ways in which we all are carrying these stories about our parents and about their sort of how they kind of left people to the wayside, their own kids. I don't know one person who was like, I had a great childhood. And it makes me terribly sad, but there's something really profound that comes out of this, and that's really what I want to share with you. This isn't the first time this story came out. This story came out in 2004. And Skinner was brave enough to stand on her own and say, this happened to me, and nobody cared. Nobody cared because they didn't want it to be true because they loved Alice Munro's work. And I got to tell you something. 2 things matter here. One, as much as we can look at any movement and say, well, what really changed or how impactful was it? Me Too obviously had set a new precedent for how people could speak about what happened to them and the ways in which we responded to it. Yes, it's very flawed. And yes, it's like really weirdly gendered in a way that I don't think serves us in the long run, where you just say, well, one equals abuser and one equals non-abuser. I don't think that works across gender roles, but I do think it matters that people who experienced harm can now say something in public and that there's some kind of precedent where we listen, or that there's enough people who could find each other where holding accountable and care can actually happen. Because again, she put the story out in 2004 and Alice Munro's fans were not having it. They basically were like, I don't want to hear this. It was very public. And the thing is, these are not allegations. Fremlin admitted to sexually abusing her in letters that Skinner has, right? So these are not, did it happen? Well, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe we should question it. Like, she had quantifiable evidence. And at the age of 80, he was charged. I mean, nothing like happened because he was like already old, and I don't think she wanted jail time or whatever. But the point is, like, it mattered that this had impact, and it mattered that we read Skinner's essay, and it matters that we are paying attention to her story, because we should look at Alice Munro's work differently. I mean, I'm thinking of we'll go into the politics in a minute, but if you're a real literary fan or a nerd or a buff or whatever, I'm thinking of Octavia Butler's work. I mean, so many of you have read, Parable of the Sower, but if you get to Parable of the Talents, you have this woman who really has a lot of the makings of a dictator, right? I mean, if you don't know the story, I realize I'm just throwing names around. In Parable of the Sower, it's basically the collapse of society, the privatization of everything. It's kind of where we're headed, to be honest with you. Anyway, one person, a young black woman, realizes that the belief systems that existed around her do not speak for this new reality. And when she lives in a gated community at the time, it falls apart. Anyway, she ends up wandering. Point is, fast forward, she starts to make up her new belief system. People start following her, but then in the second book, it really talks about all these years have passed, and you get the perspective of the daughter, right? Living with this person who has created this belief system that now people follow. And that she was Lauren Olamina was a really shitty mother. So, and I don't think the takeaway here is that ambitious women can't be decent people or whatever, but I think it's about interrogating the notion that the only way to be great is to be a horrible person. I mean, I'm looking at the long list of great men whose personal lives were in shambles, who treated the people around them like trash, who were, serial cheaters and serial abusers, I think, in a lot of cases. And it's like, what does it say about our society that we condition people who are quote unquote great or amazing to be this selfish, to be this individualistic? I think that it has a lot to do with all of us. But one of the key takeaways here is that Skinner kept going and she kept telling her story. And it got to a point where us in the world, we were finally able to receive it and to hear it. And I'm just glad that we are looking at it. Kind of I've seen a few people, don't want to name names, Joyce Carol Oates, who have responded really weirdly to this. Like, she was like, I haven't read it because it's behind a paywall. And it's like, bitch, you do all right. Like, read the article and let it inform you. Be informed. Because, again, this came out literally 20 years ago and we were not able to hear it then. Can we hear it now? I think it speaks to the dangers of fandoms. And also, we're in this place where it's all like, me, listen to me, and I like this person, so therefore these things also can't be true. And it's like, people are people. We're all flawed, we're all amazing, we're all shit at the same time. Let's just treat it that way. On the concept of resilience, just like move on to the next for a moment, I do want to talk about Palestine and where do we go from here? I'm going to tell you something, and I forgot, if I didn't mention it yesterday, but it feels really important to mention now, which is there's like a really intense, I'm starting to realize something, because I'm like, what would it take to get America to stop sending money to Israel? What would it take for America to stop bankrolling Israel's one-sided war on innocent people? Because that's what it's become at this point. And I started to do more research, and I started to do more research, and I started to read more, and I started to read more Chomsky, etc. Blah blah blah. I'll save you the trip. The point is, we're in a new reality where it would take somebody like AOC in a president's chair, or like Cory Bush, or any one of the squad, to stop that from happening, assuming we also had Congress. Why? Because at some point, America, right, not any individual person, America, the concept of America and the brain trust that makes America America, now believes that its existence, in order to maintain itself and its existence, having a relationship to Israel is existential to their continued existence. I know that's a bit redundant, but let me say it a different way. America doesn't believe that it can exist without having this kind of relationship to Israel, because there's this big thing that's happening above our heads that's like China, Russia, and Iran versus Britain, Israel, and America. And so when we're seeing these things that don't make sense, why weren't the protests as impactful as they ought to have been? Why does it seem like this is a bipartisan issue where they're like, even people like Fetterman is like, wait, is bipartisan the one where everybody agrees, or is it partisan? Which one is it? Oh my God, does nobody in this room know? Okay, it's okay, don't worry about it. Whatever the one where it's equal, where it's like, it's an issue that they all agree on. I forgot for a second. I think it's bipartisan. It's bipartisan. Yeah, okay, thank you. It is bipartisan. So it's a bipartisan issue where like Democrats, Republicans, we saw Fetterman become a literal different person. Like, remember how the right was trying to say that he was a clone because he was like super working class and he would show up in his like basketball shorts and his hoodies, and we were like, man, this guy is awesome. But then he turned into like a weird, like kind of like pseudo right-wing freak when it came to Israel. And everybody was confused because I thought Fetterman was like kind of my guy. Like in my head, if I was a white guy, that's how big I would be and that's what I would look like. I'm like, give me an Adam Sandler wardrobe, right? And like I've been working in the unions my whole life kind of face. Like, give me that. I want that swag. And he ended up being a bit of a freak. Like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how quickly that happened. But in this new reality, it is essential for us to understand that America is bankrolling Israel because it believes that having that relationship is existential to itself. So that's what new thing we're operating under. And that matters because what hope do we have of stopping that funding from going, right? It made me think about Hamas, for example, right? Like that's been the lightning rod issue. It's like, do you condemn Hamas? You must condemn Hamas. Every bad thing, Hamas, right? And you've heard me criticize Hamas in terms of like, this is not, Palestinian people did not elect Hamas, but I want to tell you why I don't, this war is, again, one-sided war is going to go on. Let me ask you something. I'm going to ask you something right now. Think about all the kinds of wars, re the Middle East, that America has been involved with, right? I remember when Saddam Hussein was the issue, his face was everywhere. Think about Al-Qaeda, right? But it was bin Laden's face. He was everywhere. This has been going on for ages now, right? We've been dealing with this for like months and months and months. We've been really dealing with this for years. When you think of Hamas, why can't you think of a face? Why can't you think of a name? There are specific leaders of that particular political party. And let's be clear, Al-Qaeda wasn't a political party in the way that Hamas was. Hamas was a legitimate political party. Why can't you think of a face? Is it so that we feel like every Palestinian could be Hamas, maybe? So that there's technically no innocent Palestinian ever that exists? Because every Palestinian could potentially be Hamas. That is why. I was talking to a friend who had been, dealing with, their parents and everything else, and they were having this conversation. And if you are reading the articles right now, it seems like, and I looked, right? Like I'm just like, you guys know I go through all the things. I read all the things from like Reuters, AP, blah, 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 blah. And it just, there's a theme that's kind of like, well, Hamas rejected the deal. Or like Israel didn't comply. But there's a thing where it's like, well, why doesn't Hamas just do this thing? Why don't they just end it, right? There's so many levels to that, but I'll just say Hamas is in power because Israel chose Hamas. That's not an opinion. That is an objective fact. The other things that existed, the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, Israel cut those political bodies off at the knees, right? And they bolstered Hamas in power. That is the only reason why Hamas continues to be the voice box for Palestinian peoples currently. And so on one hand, you have Israel that has made Hamas out to be the only voice for the Palestinian people, while saying but it's a faceless voice, because therefore every Palestinian can be an evil person. So they put up this voice without a face, and it's doing so to ensure that there's endless conflict, so that there's endless justification for the most horrific kinds of brutal behavior you can imagine, right? And in the meantime, Palestinians are stuck in this position where the only voice that they have, because the entire world has turned, and by the way, this is I should say the superpowers of the world have turned their backs on them. This is the only voice that they have to say, hey, do you know that these settlements are still happening? And they're seizing all this land. And do you know that we're being killed left, right, and center? I mean, Al Jazeera got pushed out. That's the only voice that Palestinians have. And so it's this awful situation. But I need us to understand the ways in which America not only bankrolls it, but propagates this idea that Hamas is just a faceless voice that is calling for the eradication, the elimination of Jewish people. And I got to tell you, this shit just hit me today when I realized I'm a thinking person. I'm out there. I could tell you a couple of names or whatever, but I was there during all of these major crises in the Middle East. We knew who they were. We knew who the quote unquote enemy was, right? But all we've gotten out of this is Hamas. And any Palestinian could be Hamas. I can blow up a hospital because Hamas. With babies in it, Hamas. I can blow up a school. I can blow up a place where I told refugees to go because Hamas. I can do anything I want because Hamas. And American media has been fueling this. And I'm just like, wow. The extent to which America has sort of enabled this endless conflict and is bankrolling it again while our people suffer, while Palestinians suffer, while kids are going into debt from needing lunch at schools. Well, infrastructure friggin' collapses while people have to do gig work and are working 3 jobs and still can't make rent in most places across America. What are we doing? Because this theme is resilience, you think to yourself, you might think, man, this is impossible. I don't even know what to do. Palestinian people are still telling us what they need and what they want. I'm going to tell you right now, I did some research, and we need more than just a permanent ceasefire. Gaza needs to be rebuilt. I'm telling you what Palestinians want. If you study any form of colonialism, you know that one of the things that they do is you get fractured up, and so there's a lot of infighting between oppressed peoples, right? And we can see it because I'm just why do we have an oppression Olympics? What are we doing, But we do have this thing where when people are colonized and abused and brutalized, there's a lot of fights on how to win. I referenced some of them yesterday where it's instead of just fighting the system and looking up, we keep looking across at each other. The point is, I was about to say something weird, I'm Hamas, but I'm no, that's no. Sorry. There is a unified voice that is coming out of Palestine right now, and it's maybe one of the most unified voices in recent history, again, because there's been so many competing needs and opinions on how to save us from getting murdered. So in May, the PC-PSR poll, so they did a poll in May that found out 79% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza sought either a reconciliation or reunification of Gaza and the West Bank, and also the formation of a national unity government that would be empowered to negotiate with Israel. Palestinian people are saying what they want. So what we need is not just a permanent ceasefire, because again, every time you hear this deal and you're like, why does this deal fail? This is Hamas's fault. It's no, the deals are designed to fail. Every deal that is put forth to Palestinians, to Hamas, is designed to fail. a lot of it has to do with the fact that Israel just keeps trying to intends to keep all the land that they've seized in this manufactured conflict. Gaza needs to be rebuilt, and the Palestinians who live there have to be permitted to move back home. That's one of the ways that we can, that's one of the things that we can call for. That's one of the things that we can demand. And the territory should be free to conduct trade, and its residents should be able to travel for study or any other reason. The reason why these deals, a major reason why these deals keep getting rejected, right? Not the ones that are designed to fail, and I think a lot of them are, but is because they don't allow Palestinians any kind of autonomy, any kind of freedom, any kind of movement. What kind of life is that? That's how they were living before. That's what led to this moment. So, I want to say that even though things feel impossible right now, from these stories, right? This was, for Skinner, it was 20 years in the making. For Palestinians, we're talking about since 1948, really before then. My point is, if they can keep going, so can we. If they can keep having demands, and if they can keep asking us and pushing us to unify, to believe in a future, to believe in possibility, then so can we. So that's what I'm going to do. Because I got to tell you, it's hard. I'm like, we have the worst kinds of representation in recent history. And maybe one of the worst. You know what? Every person probably felt that way. I'm just thinking of the plague, and they were just like, this is probably the worst time to be alive in history, because that shit really did a number on people. The bubonic plague, I'm just like, nah. Maybe it is that every generation believes that it's like the worst time to be alive, because we've made being alive so hard as humans when it could have just been awesome. We can blame the West. But, realistically, it's like our takeaways, I think, are not only to keep pushing, but to keep dreaming, to keep fighting. And then also, like, that resilience. I don't believe that strength should be determined by how much suffering we can endure. I think strength should come from how hard we can dream and how far we're willing to push ourselves to make those dreams come true. So, with that, all the love in the world. If today's, episode triggered a lot of y'all or activated a lot of y'all, just know, like, my heart's with you. There's resources out there for survivors, but honestly, fuck shitty parents, even if they're great fucking writers. Maybe they're not so great. Maybe they're not so great. Great writers don't necessarily mean great people. And you know what? I don't even like her work that much anymore. Sorry, Munro. I couldn't really give a fuck. So on to the next. Let's get that question of the day.
Hi, this is Sanika. I'm a 5 Keys student, and I want to know, people like Donald Trump, and I just want to know, why do they like Donald Trump? What's getting them to want to vote for him and, just like him so much and everything?
Do you know what? Sometimes I think questions get way too over-intellectual and over-analyzed, and that's it. That's it. Thank you for that question, because the guy has likability. Donald Trump has likability, and that's weird. That's very weird. But he was a reality TV star before all of this, right? Now he was a president because of that, and now he's slated to possibly ruin America as we know it. And I think it has a lot to do with propagandism, and I think it has to do with, like, simplicity. Like, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that, like, he's talking about draining the swamp, and he's talking about the corruption of, like, politicians. Meanwhile, he's also a politician and then also a billionaire, sort of. Because, like, I don't even know if the checkbook's balancing these days. I'm not even sure. But I think it speaks to we can't underscore how many racists live in America. I think I always try to, like, minimize that because it's a really awkward truth. But there has always been a white supremacist contingent. The thing is, we created enough normalcy and enough balance that they weren't loud and that they couldn't organize. They couldn't mobilize in a particular way. Like, nobody accepted the ending of slavery. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, we enforced a culture that was so clear that that became the norm and the standard, and that culture is now being challenged. And that culture still wasn't good enough for, I think, what was owed. But, my thing is, I think we got to admit that he's likable in very specific ways to specific people. If I'm removing the racist part to it, I think that his rhetoric is very accessible. I think he points to a very clear enemy. And what are the Democrats going to do? Point to themselves? They don't point at the other side. We know that. They don't point anywhere. They don't point to the future. They don't point to the other side. They don't point at themselves. And I think he delivers like a clear message, at least on that. And it's like, we're not getting that from the Democrats. I don't know what we get from the Democrats, but the truth is we do have real leftists out there that are giving a clear vision of the future. And I think we do have that on this side. They're not better at talking. They're just better funded. We can empower each other more. I think if we stop like throwing stones at each other and started really building each other up, if somebody's missing something in their talk, they didn't hit all the buttons, maybe tell them what it is instead of calling them out. Maybe like network across, maybe like actually support each other towards growth. I think, there's appeal in simplicity and there's appeal in support. And one of these things, the last thing I'll say is like, them niggas is loyal. I don't know what's up with racists, but they kind of like each other a lot. It's weird. I'm like, I can't say the same about anti-racists. We don't seem to like each other at all. Like, we're just like, I hate racism. And also you. I really hate you. I don't like you at all. I don't like your semi-mullet. And I don't like your fucking Doc Martens. I don't like you at all. So we got some work to do. There is a lasting appeal, I think, of people who are really good at talking shit and talking. And maybe we need people who give us a better, stronger vision of the future. And the best part is, though, y'all, is that we actually have it. We don't need to find those people. They already exist. So thank you for that brilliant question. And, on to the next. This is it, y'all. This is the end. I want to just say thank you so much for listening to Landline. This is a labor of love. And every episode we put out comes from the heart. New episodes drop on the daily. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, and we're going to be on just about everything. So just look for us. Hit us up with a question. Don't forget, we love a voice note. So it's just landline with jfk@gmail.com. Shout out to Alyssa and the Landline team. And shout out to you, the listeners, who make it all possible. Peace.